Center for Dialogue, which is here on the traditional lands of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and the Squamish Nation. And it's also here in the city of Vancouver, which has begun to forge a path for a 100% renewable city, and it's a direction that we inevitably have to go if we're going to avoid dangerous climate change. My name is Alex Bosson. I'm the new ED of Renewable Cities, and I follow in the wake of Shauna Sylvester and Michael Small, who are around the room here somewhere, and they've set an Enable course, and I'm not exactly sure why they're not on deck any longer. I think it's because we're heading into rough waters, and they're in the bunks with a little bit of gravel, trying to figure out the next course that we're going to make a correction on. But we still have a great crew, and the great crew has been responsible for putting together really great events like this that foster deep discussion and increase awareness about how we are going to take on this challenge that lies ahead of us. And Renewable Cities, in the last 4 years, has played a really, really decisive catalytic role in establishing 100% renewable cities as a major agenda on the urban map around the world. There's probably about three or four other organizations that Renewable Cities has been collaborating with to do this work. Dialogues like this wouldn't happen without a tremendous amount of support from a variety of different sources. The most important are the North Growth Foundation and the Sitka Foundation. They are the backbone of this organization and are critical, and their vision has helped us set our course. PICS generously supports our webcast, and we have about 400 people online in the shadows of the legislature in Victoria and in the shadows of the Peace Tower in Ottawa, being two big places. Welcome you all. If you are interested in engaging in the conversation, the hashtag is RECities, and you're welcome to raise questions and comments through that hashtag. And we could not exist also without SFU's commitment to really meaningful engagement on important public policy issues. And that is our home, the MJ Wask SFU Center for Dialogue. What's going to happen after my introductory remarks? We'll hear from Minister Heyman, and then we'll embark on a dialogue with questions and comments from you and our online crowd. And if you once again have questions from the online world, you raise those through Twitter. And I'd ask everyone to mute their cell phones. And we have to wrap up by 1:30. There's a few people that have apprised me that they have to be back to the office by 2 o'clock. And they want to stop by the BCLC and pick up some BC wine. One thing I would encourage you to do is also drop by the butcher and pick up some Alberta beef to enjoy with your wine, because we have to all together figure out how we're going to manage this really difficult agenda ahead of us. I have been permitted 2 minutes to prime the pump. It's an air source heat pump, and we're not very familiar with it in this part of the world. My technical abilities are beyond me. If we can just advance to the first slide. I'm going to do some Monty Python-esque maneuver with my hands to start advancing the slide. BC is a decisive jurisdiction in North America and really the world. BC was actually the first provincial jurisdiction in North America to really acknowledge the critical role that local governments must play to advance a deep emission reduction agenda. And that happened firstly by negotiating a climate action charter. I'm going to curtsy or something in order to advance slides. Hello, please advance slide. That was first done through the Climate Action Charter. The Climate Action Charter, if nobody has read it, if you haven't read it, take an opportunity to review it. The #1 commitment from a community perspective for local governments that they voluntarily signed on to, and that's virtually every single local government in British Columbia, is to create complete, compact, and energy-efficient communities. There was a recognition that local and provincial government have to collaboratively work together to drive this agenda. They have to remove barriers. They have to implement policies and actions that address this fundamentally critical agenda. The other important aspect of the Climate Action Charter was there was an acknowledgement that it isn't just a climate hair shirt. We have an opportunity to build better communities in British Columbia, that we can strengthen our prosperity, we can strengthen social imperatives, we can also strengthen environmental imperatives by charting an effective course. That was followed up with the Green Communities Act, the first jurisdiction in North America to require local governments to establish targets, policies, and actions. And what has happened subsequently is astonishing. There's no jurisdiction in Canada, and potentially just one state, maybe two in the United States, where you see the volume of action that is being taken by local governments. And it wouldn't happen without visionary leadership from elected officials, great civil servants doing diligent work and understanding how to exploit the opportunities, a huge amount of work from the private sector that have brought an incredible amount of innovation, and a wide variety of different civil society groups. And this is something that we're in together. And this is the only way that we're going to manage this agenda. However, when we take a look at what the targets that most municipalities have laid out and the targets of the province, we're not making a heck of a lot of progress, or as much progress as we need to. This is a tough slog. We've only reduced our emissions 5% out of the last inventory that goes out to 2015. And we're not on track to make that 33% emission reduction target. Certainly not on track to make that 80% emission reduction target by 2050. This is serious work, and we have to align our provincial and local agendas and federal agendas to steer this course collectively. And that is an opportunity that presents itself with the climate plan update that the BC government is currently just embarking into. And I don't think there's a better person to be at the helm of the Ministry of Climate or Environment and Climate Change strategy than the current minister. He understands the public service. Somebody who was the president of the BCGEU, he knows how government works. He was also the president of the Sierra Club and had important files on energy, on the green economy, and also climate change. And from a dialogue perspective, he's been at the lectern here many a time, helping engage in dialogue with professionals to better understand how we can develop a shared agenda. So I'd like to invite the Minister George Heyman.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alex. And I want to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered here on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And before I say other words about climate and cities, I also want to just say the last 10 days have been a bit of a whir, a blur, and there's been a lot of activity, and I just want to thank all of the British Columbians who have stood with our government and thanked us for standing strong for BC's interests, for First Nations interests, for our economy, for our coastline, which is also Canada's coastline. So whether you're in the room or online, thank you very much. I know I'm billed as here to outline BC's new climate plan and how city priorities fit into that, but I'm going to start by going off script a little bit. I think you need to know a little bit about what drives me, why I wanted this job, why I ran for politics, what I think we need to do together to make a difference in British Columbia, in Canada, in the world. Alex referred to my time, my 25 years as a negotiator, 9 years as president of the BC Government and Service Employees Union. And in my last years, People have a particular view of unions and don't necessarily think of unions as caring about environmental issues, but I think what unions do care about very much is what impacts the people we represent. And in my last few years, activists in the union would come to me and say, we keep hearing more and more about how climate change will impact our future, will impact the rest of the world. And we're concerned because it doesn't look like people are talking about it enough or doing enough about it in the circles in which we travel. And people listen to you because of the position you hold. So please, take some time to learn more, take some time to speak out, take some time to build bridges and organize. So in my last year as president of the union, I took the Al Gore Inconvenient Truth training in Montreal. I took it with Councillor Andrea Reimer, who I think is in the room here somewhere, and we have been supporters and colleagues ever since. Hi. I left the union wondering what I could do to try to bridge some of the gaps between social activism, which had been my whole life, social action concerns, social justice, and environmental concerns, especially the pressing ones of climate change. And it led me to apply for a job that I frankly didn't think I'd get, but I got it. I was hired as executive director of Sierra Club BC, and in all of the work that Sierra Club did, it became apparent that you couldn't talk about conservation, you couldn't talk about old growth, you couldn't talk about species at risk, you couldn't talk about anything unless you talked about climate and you thought about what needed to be done to transition to the future that we all theoretically know we need to arrive at, but people have such trouble coming to grips with. If we look around, we see how quickly, and our neighbors see how quickly, the world's changing, whether it's extreme weather, the worst fire season we ever had in BC, hurricanes, displacements. It's not the future, it's today. But in order for people to get their heads around what we can do about today and tomorrow, we have to find a way to engage people in a better today and a better tomorrow. I went to my first COP climate conference in Bonn late last year. Two things struck me personally, and they struck me deeply. One of them was the many Indigenous people from around the world, including Canada, who spoke about the impacts on Indigenous people of climate change, on their land, on their food, on their culture, and even on their language, because their language is tied to the land. And what is at stake for Indigenous people is their identity and their survival. The other thing that struck me was the tremendous resolve and initiative of the subnational level, cities, states, provinces, to take action irrespective of what national governments were doing. And nothing summed this up better than the U.S. Climate Alliance of 14 United States, who together form an economy about 7th largest in the world, representing over a third of the population of the U.S., who joined with corporations, cities, and others to say, we are still in, as in we are still in the Paris Agreement, and we will forge ahead and take measures and make a difference. Those lessons have stayed with me, and they've driven me in what I'm trying to do as we build a new climate plan, a meaningful climate plan in British Columbia. In 2015, the previous government appointed a climate leadership team. I see Sephora Berman, one of the members of the team, a hardworking member of the team, and somebody who raises awareness about the issue of climate change every day in the room. The team was appointed, it was asked to report to the government, and it was largely ignored. I've said since my appointment, and I've said for many months before my appointment, that what we really need in British Columbia is a real climate plan, a meaningful climate plan with new targets, a renewed carbon price, and renewed resolve. We saw from 2008 to 2011 some initial reductions in emissions in British Columbia when Gordon Campbell brought in a plan and when a carbon tax was brought in. But that's been followed with the latest data that we have for 2015 with emissions increases in 4 of the 5 years leading up to 2015. We have big challenges. We have big choices, but we also have huge opportunities. And those are the kinds of things that I think we want to talk about today, together, and in the coming months. In Bonn, I had a chance to meet with representatives of states and cities from Europe, from the United States, from elsewhere, from small island nations who are facing catastrophic results in displacement. But I heard some tremendous regional initiatives, whether it's Copenhagen, Amsterdam, and others who have such advanced active transportation and public transit infrastructure, whether it's the district in the southwest German city of Freiburg that plans to meet its entire heat supply from solar, thermal, and district heat, whether it's Mexico City's climate action program that's focused on adaptation and resilience for the most vulnerable of their populations. But I've also learned a lot here at home. I've gone and attended for 5 years at the Union of BC Municipalities Convention, the Municipal Climate Leadership Council breakfast. And what was clear for me from year 1 through to year 5 is that municipalities around British Columbia aren't waiting for others to show the way. Yes, people need partners. Yes, people need a plan. But actions around BC have been taking place for years. Solutions, actions, and initiatives. Over half of BC municipalities, whether it's Souk or Fernie or Vancouver or Valemount, representing 80% of BC's population, have community energy and emissions plans. North and West Vancouver are collaborating on step code implementation, and in Vancouver, which has its own charter, very ambitious work has begun on energy efficiency codes and standards. We've seen a tremendous electric vehicle fast charging network accelerate Kootenays on Highway 3 in order to put fast chargers to allow people to actually get from A to B over long distances in rural British Columbia with electric vehicles. Now people along the Highway 16 corridor are interested in the same. And yet British Columbia, which legislated targets for emission reductions for 2020, is going to collectively fail miserably in meeting that target, as in we cannot possibly meet it. The province didn't walk the walk. We haven't given cities the help that you need. We know that local governments and local government decisions influence about half of BC greenhouse gas emissions. But provincial policies impact the same sources of emissions, and you need policies from the provincial government that can make your actions more meaningful. So let's look. Let's look at what's happening elsewhere. What examples can we see? In France, in the United Kingdom, in India, in Germany, in China, in California, everywhere, people are making plans to phase out the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles over the next 2 decades. Norway is already at 24% with very aggressive plans for 2025. GM and Ford have recently announced they plan to phase out, at least in light-duty vehicles, internal combustion engines in fairly short order, and Volvo has made it clear they are moving to zero-emission vehicles. It's time for the BC government to define clear near-term goals and create clear plans. We will start by setting the 2030 target that was recommended by the climate leadership team of a 40% reduction below 2007 levels by 2030. So there is a benchmark on our way to 2050. It will be a challenge. We need to achieve this by setting targets for the built environment, for transportation, for the industrial sector, and we need to work with citizens and municipalities to get there. So we will be developing a plan over the coming months that will give British Columbians an idea of what are the things that the province is going to do in conjunction with municipalities to meet these targets. We'll be doing that through the Climate Action Secretariat, but also through the new Climate Solutions and Clean Growth Advisory Council that we've set up. Some members are here today. I think Matt Horn is here. I know Nancy Olwider from SFU couldn't be here, but is a member. Karen Tamwu, I think, is not here. I believe Taylor Backrack is online. Tessica Truong is here in the room, I believe. Also, Jody Osborne and Taylor Backrack represent municipalities on the council. We need to identify early opportunities for success, and we need to act. We know the climate leadership team said we should have a target of zero-emission vehicles, 30% of new car sales by 2030. We're at just over 1% now. There is tremendous interest, but interest needs infrastructure and access. I talked in Bonn with representatives of Washington, Oregon, California, members of the Pacific Coast Collaborative about how we can have shared access and infrastructure up and down the coast, but we need to work with municipalities, with the City of Vancouver, with Metro Vancouver, to make owning an electric vehicle attractive and easy, not a challenge. Vancouver, Saanich, Victoria, Nelson, and Slocan all have 100% renewable energy targets. But to do that, provincial help is needed. We can set standards for new buildings, but we need to retrofit existing buildings for steep building emission reductions. We have a plan, and we will be outlining it to help, starting with public buildings, but there are also many programs that can make it attractive for homeowners, for commercial building owners to do the retrofits that will achieve these steep reductions. We can do it with a variety of programs like Pay As You Save. And the other thing we need to do in Metro Vancouver, as well as around the province, but particularly in our dense urban areas, is deal with the long-stalled transit solution that's been hanging in the air for far too long. My government is focused on affordability for families, services to people, a sustainable modern economy, which means we need to support the transition to the future. My job is to weave climate awareness and a climate plan through all of our other initiatives. The truth is that changes that reduce emissions often come because there is an opportunity to make life better, more comfortable, more satisfying, and more affordable for people. Easier, more comfortable. And cities and towns can be made more stable, healthier, and supportive communities in which to live. Isn't that what people expect of municipal governments? And shouldn't our provincial government be standing with municipal governments as we together develop climate plans and actions to meet our targets and make life better for everyone? The Chinese character for crisis is a combination of danger and opportunity. I began my remarks by talking about our responsibility to safeguard vulnerable populations, to protect and acknowledge that the people on the front line in terms of negative impacts are Indigenous communities. We cannot stand by while climate change threatens the identity and survival of First Peoples. We owe it. We owe it to ourselves, our kids, our grandkids, to seize these opportunities that this danger presents. BC municipalities have been doing just that for a number of years. It's time that your government, our government, stands with you as we move towards solutions. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have about almost 200 people here and about 400 people online. So it gives you about 7 seconds a person to raise a question, and then about a 10-second response for the minister. my point is just, though, try and be succinct. And I would implore you, if you can, connect your questions and your comments to the urban agenda. And why that is so important, it's 50% of BC's emissions. And they're the biggest opportunities for maximizing co-benefits that we have. They're some of the cheapest emission reduction opportunities, but we need a variety of regulations, fiscal tools, educational tools to drive this agenda. And I'm going to open the floor. You can just raise your hands, and then I'll come around and I'll periodically go to the online community as well. Richard Campbell.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the comment. It's good to hear giving the municipalities more power and having provincial decisions support them. Now, there's been a challenge with the Ministry of Transportation. They don't seem always responsive to this. So there's a few, one example coming up, there's a huge upgrade plan for Horseshoe Bay Terminal, which kind of fits into the old model of doing things. For people walking and cycling, that terminal is very inconvenient. So perhaps there's the opportunity to look at a different model for BC Ferries that more supports people walking and cycling with more convenient terminals, rather than investing a whole bunch of money in something like BC Ferries. Similarly, there's the Patello Bridge, which is right by rapid transit stations, yet it's still being planned in the old school with massive highway off-ramps instead of the opportunity for transit-oriented development near rapid transit. So it would be just a question, encouraging you and asking you if there will be a focus on all government decisions going forward to really support the compact communities that everyone wants.
Thank you, Richard. I'll be very quick in my answer. One of the things that I learned very early is that government is large, complex. Crown corporations and agencies often are operating on lock with plans that began many years ago, and that what we need to do to impact infrastructure in a way that that takes note of active transportation, other modes of transportation, public transportation, ultimately all the things we have to do to reduce emissions, is develop a thread and a set of benchmarks against which we check our actions. So one of the first things I asked the Climate Solutions Council to do was to turn their mind to what we needed to do in terms of public spending on new buildings and infrastructure that we could communicate as part of a plan to change how we focus on the plans. We have some buildings that basically were designed and ready to go out to tender. We want to make sure that the next ones are treated differently, and that we look for opportunities, say, for net zero in transportation infrastructure. We need to look to accommodate transit and active transportation much more. It will take some time to make the shift, but I think that's why we need to be thoughtful about what the early priorities and the early opportunities are to make visible difference and focus our early actions on those things.
Front row right there. And if you have an organizational affiliation that you want to share with us, you are welcome to do so. And that was Richard Campbell, who is a BC Bike Coalition.
Hello, I'm Emily Adden. I'm with the City of North Vancouver. We certainly are taking a leadership role at the City of North Vancouver with electrical vehicle charging stations, albeit I do have some concerns with the current climate action plan and in Mr. Heyman's remarks with regard to focus on electric vehicles. And I just wonder if the Minister could comment on how consideration of social impacts and health impacts of single occupancy vehicles are being considered at the same time as climate action effects with regards to transportation.
That's an excellent point, and thank you for raising it. I've said in other speeches I've given that while zero-emission vehicles are an important step forward, a bigger step is more accessible, widespread public transit that makes it easy and attractive for people to use. whether it's an electric or an internal combustion vehicle, frankly, congestion is both an economic and a health problem for people. So I don't disagree with you, but many people will be driving, and when they are driving, I hope they're not spewing greenhouse gases.
I'm going to go to the front row, and then just raise your hand so I start keeping a speakers list. And in front of you, you should have a small form that is soliciting advice to the ministry on your thoughts on the most important priorities for advancing this climate agenda. You're welcome to populate it. If you would like to hear from the ministry about how they are planning to engage on this agenda, you should also include your name and contact information, and it's only going to be shared with the ministry. So we'll go to the front, and then please push your microphone once you've finished your question.
Yeah, I'd like to address what I consider the elephant in the room. I've never seen any plan by any jurisdiction in British Columbia to require a solar component on all new construction and development, which would greatly reduce our need for further electrical power. You made a lot of comments about Indigenous peoples and respecting them, and at the same time, what you're doing to the Treaty 8 peoples at the Site C River Dam seems to be in direct contradiction to what you speak about. We have far better ways to produce that electricity, and in fact, we don't even need that electricity. So I'd like you to comment on the Site C Dam, because I find many of your comments to be completely disingenuous in regards to what you're doing at Site C on the Peace River.
Sure. Let me address the solar question first, though. I think part of the role of the Climate Action Secretariat and the Climate Plan is to create policies that will drive the actions of a whole range of different ministries, whether it's municipal affairs and housing or energy, mines and petroleum resources, in which BC Hydro resides, to put in the kinds of requirements you're talking about. I think we also need to look at issues like community solar to maximize good sites. I'm going to address Site C very quickly. I certainly don't claim that that's the best way to get energy, and that wasn't the basis of our decision. We were dealing, and I know many people dispute our figures or our financial analysis, but we were dealing with what we were convinced was an overwhelming ultimate debt of $4 billion that could not be amortized according to the advice we received from Finance Ministry and Treasury Board officials, and that would put a drain on both BC Hydro and or the Treasury. I'm not happy with the decision. I'm not happy with being put in the position to have to deal with a project that should have been reviewed by the Utilities Commission before it began, and then deal with something with a sunk cost of $4 billion. But all I've asked of people is, I know people disagree. I know people disagree with the basis of our decision, but we made it in good faith. We made it not with joy, not because we thought it was the best source of energy, not because we thought it was ultimately the best way to treat First Nations in the area, and I just ask people to accept we made it in good faith. In other fronts, we continue to work with First Nations, including Chief Roland Wilson, including the Treaty 8 Nations, on other initiatives in terms of dealing with fish farms, in terms of environmental assessment development, in terms of engaging them in assessment of other projects.
We'll go to the second from the center, right there. And if you've discontinued speaking, can you just, thank you very much.
Thanks. My name's Sue Maxwell, and I'm a councillor with the Resort Municipality of Whistler. I see in a lot of the examples that you that were showing before that some of the reductions are coming from reducing solid waste, and I know that that was shown as a segment of the emissions that we have. I was just wondering if in the new climate plan that there would be some actions towards reducing waste significantly, as a lot of the research done by the US EPA or the
Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives have shown that zero waste can increase jobs and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so I was just wondering if there could be a component around that, or perhaps a provincial zero waste plan.
Thank you, and interestingly, that is the one example I skipped because I knew I was running over time. But we are actively engaged with the Zero Waste Council. We are working towards zero waste, whether it's through regulation or ultimately the climate plan. We're reviewing the organic matter recycling regulation for exactly the reasons that you've raised.
Solid waste is really an excellent example of how provinces and local governments have collaborated to drive that agenda. And it really is quite something to see a 30% emission reduction since 2007. I see that we have right here from Metro Vancouver, Paul Henderson, that's managed that file, was formerly with the City of Vancouver, and the work that's been done is really quite exceptional. And not only local governments and the province, from landfills to curbside, but we've had citizens literally stepping up to the plate, scraping it off, and bringing it to the curb. And it has been astonishing, the millions and millions of people across the province that have been willing to do that. 75% diversion rates in some municipalities. We're going to go to second row from the back. Or sorry, right there, gentleman in the black.
Yeah, it's Louis Conway, Architectural Institute of BC, Post-Disaster Response Committee. Yeah, I commend the emphasis on building retrofits to bring emissions down and setting targets in that area. I also think in a city like Vancouver, a lot of those buildings in need of retrofit are also highly vulnerable buildings to shocks like earthquake. And I think there is an urban opportunity to combine the the climate plan with the disaster risk reduction agenda, and taking advantage of existing programs in cities like Vancouver, such as the development of the resilience strategy. So these two agendas need to come together. I think climate change and disaster risk reduction. Do you see that as part of the scope of your of the development of the climate change plan for British Columbia?
Well, I've already dealt with what I think are the tremendous opportunities to reduce emissions through both new codes and retrofits. There's also side benefits in terms of how quickly it is paid off, how much more comfortable it is for people to live and work, and ultimately how it raises economic productivity. But we're very aware that wherever we're doing a seismic upgrade, it's a great opportunity to do the full range of energy efficiency and seismic together, and there's economies to be gained there.
We'll go to the back row here, and then to Gordon Price over there.
Thanks very much. My name is Douglas Gook, and I live in the Quesnel River watershed. George, I've known you for, I think, about 35 years, and have respected your work tremendously over all of those years, except for a couple decisions that has been in your purview with your government. Being from a rural area, and seeing how this is dam related, both of them. The Site C Dam, I view, is one of the greatest white elephants, and I think it needs way more attention from you. And the other dam that I'm speaking of, and something that has cut my respect of your ministry to the bone, and that is letting provincial charges drop from the Imperial Metals Mount Poly dam burst. This was very much First Nations respect related also, as Bev Sellers, former chief of Hatsul, kept provincial laws in play. And it was your decision to drop the possibility of maintaining, pursuing provincial charges. For anybody that has been involved with the Mount Poly disaster, the thousands of tons of mercury and heavy metals are coming to a Salish Sea beach near you. Every day it flows from the Quesnel Lake, Quesnel River, Fraser River, and landing here. So I'm wondering about the importance of true respect for rural areas of BC and what your government's going to do to reclaim any sort of respect with regards to those two decisions.
I think I've addressed Site C, and I don't want to get into a back and forth. We disagree about that. We don't necessarily disagree about what the best sources of energy starting from a base of zero is, or what a good decision starting from a base of zero is. That's not where we started. On the matter of the decision to not proceed with the private charges that were laid by Chief Sellers, that was a decision of Crown Council. But let me address the issue of the expiry of the statute of limitations in British Columbia, which was what led Bev Sellers to lay the charge, to try to hold that open. The investigation has taken a very long time. It's a joint investigation of the BC Conservation Officer Service and federal officials, including the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. It is ongoing. The federal statute of limitations is 5 years. The penalties under the Fisheries Act are far more stringent than penalties that currently exist under the BC Act. We're reviewing those, as well as the BC statute of limitations. And of course, there is the possibility of criminal prosecution. I check in on this regularly. The investigation is independent, so I don't necessarily get the detail of what they're finding, but I have sought assurance that it will be completed well within the federal statute, and it will be thorough and complete, and if charges are warranted, that is exactly the intention of the federal government. So in terms of Imperial Metals and the Mount Polley disaster, it's not completed by a long shot.
Okay, I'm starting to get a very long speakers list. So I'm going to take the gentleman maroon first. We'll go to some online questions, Gordon Price, and then this gentleman here. And then if I've acknowledged you by hand, you're on my list. And I hope that we get through. We have about 15 minutes, 17 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Minister, for coming. I'd like to commend your ministry on the recent decision to review the components of dilbit and the behavior of dilbit in the environment. This, I think, will take us a great way down the road to protecting British Columbia interests and the interests of the planet. My question to you is about strategy. The federal government is clearly trying to disconnect greenhouse gas reduction here in Canada from greenhouse gas reduction elsewhere. In other words, downstream from people using oil sands materials. They seem to think that there are two different worlds, what we do here in Canada and what happens elsewhere in the world. What can we do to bring that strategy to play where it's clear that downstream climate impacts of the Trans Mountain Kinder Morgan pipeline have to be considered in any decision involving health of humans, health of the planet, but the federal government has managed to disconnect those. How is this possible in a rational world?
I can't really comment on the federal government's rationale, although I think we all understand your point. The recent, yesterday in fact, announced changes to federal environmental assessment include climate impacts. It's many, many pages, hundreds. I haven't had a chance to review it. I'm not clear whether they're including only those in Canada or ones downstream.
Only upstream.
Yeah. We will be reviewing environmental assessment here in British Columbia as well. I think there's some challenges in terms of how and where emissions are counted, but I think we need to have a plan that works for BC and that also takes account of what our actions and what our products impact in a world environment. And I think to do that, we actually need a different level of world conversation and multinational conversation around real approaches to reducing emissions worldwide. The flaw of leaving it to every nation to deal with what happens inside their nation is we don't reach agreements on how we're going to do it together. So I don't have an answer or a strategy to that, but I think if we are to meet the Paris targets, while it's important to take action in Vancouver, it's important to take action in British Columbia, obviously we need to take action internationally. We need to show leadership here, but we need the action to be around the world, and we need it to be in a way that transitions and lifts people into some form of decent standard of living worldwide.
Thank you.
We'll go to an online question.
So this question comes from Mark Gruel. How can we make low-carbon, resilient urbanism attractive and feasible in northern cities?
I'm not sure I'm the expert on that, and I'm not sure Taylor has a microphone. I think, but I know that for instance, much can be done to increase public transit options in northern communities. There's obviously an economy of scale problem. Things can be done around vehicle charging infrastructure. I mentioned the Accelerate Kootenays project. I know there's interest along the Highway 16 corridor so that people would actually have an option. There's a lot of, I know I spent many years living in Terrace. There is a lot of fuel used to heat homes in cold winters, and I think aggressively retrofitting and having a strong building code to both reduce energy use and find new sources of energy are among the things that can be done, and I think the provincial government needs to work with northern municipalities to do that. Prince George recently put in a district energy heating system in the downtown core. There are initiatives like that all throughout rural British Columbia, and I mentioned the municipal climate leadership breakfasts as well as the council. They spur each other on by trading success stories.
Just a small comment on that. One of the few areas where there hasn't been the same degree of success across British Columbia, and it's really tough, is just focusing land use, focusing growth. And that's an opportunity. It doesn't matter if it's a small town, big town. We have beautiful small towns across British Columbia, historically, where people were able to drive very short distances or walk. We have to get back to that opportunity. It's going to be good for our public health. I'm going to go to Gordon Price.
Thanks, Alex.
And then Dale Littlejohn after that.
Minister, welcome to the WASC. You're welcome here anytime. I sat on the TransLink board going back to 1999, so right away I was interested to see that the place we're doing the worst is transportation, up 14%. Now, it's not as though we don't have, well, it's not as though we don't have actually electric vehicles. We've got one going back to the 80s, works great. It's called SkyTrain. And the minister, you know, we have a plan and we have the vision and we even have proposals for funding, but the pattern is always the same. The region does the heavy lifting, goes to the province says, nope, even the obscenity of the referendum. So it's a little discouraging to hear from the Premier kind of the same tone when he was being interviewed by Von Palmer. Here's a few quotes on mobility pricing. It's the mayors who will have to defend their position. Nothing will be rubber stamped. Recommendations will be rejected if they're not consistent with the provincial government's agenda. All fair stuff, by the way. That's the kind of negotiation that goes back and forth. But there's nothing that I haven't heard going back to governments, hey, back to 2000 at least. Same tone, same kind of attitude, same expectation. So my question is, where's the love? Where's the enthusiasm that we heard from you? Because if it's going to be the same damn thing, you know, we can move ahead now on making a difference up there. But it sounds as though it's going to be the same damn thing.
Well, I would argue, Gordon, that it isn't, and I'll start with our commitment to put not a third, but 40% funding toward the capital costs of the Bears plan, which is a significant jump, and I'll just simply say, I mean, I can't comment on quotes that I've just heard for the first time, nor do I want to, but what I can comment on is our discussions within our government about how important breaking the logjam on transit is, and my knowledge of the minister responsible, Selina Robinson, and the Parliamentary Secretary, Bowen Ma, wanting very much to work through the remaining funding needs with the mayors of Metro Vancouver so we can get this plan going.
Let's hear the love.
One thing that we should appreciate is that plan, which is a very good infrastructure plan, can benefit from better land use. It's a $7.5 billion plan. It's a Site C-size plan. And we will continue to have almost business as usual growth in greenhouse gas emissions under the mayor's vision. And that's because we can put more folks on those on the LRT and through our public transit system. And that's excellent analysis that was done by TransLink. But there's a big opportunity for adjusting a land use regime that really fits that infrastructure plan. And I'm going to go to Dale Littlejohn, and that was Gordon Price, if you didn't know, who's been a stalwart visionary in Vancouver for integrating land use and transportation. And one of the reasons that we are so far ahead in British Columbia is because of civic leaders like that, but also Dale Littlejohn Community Energy Association has building capacity for local governments for probably about 15 years. And it's one of the reasons that BC is so far ahead.
Thank you, Alex. Again, Dale Littlejohn, Executive Director of Community Energy Association and staff support for the BC Municipal Climate Leadership Council. I'm sitting between two of our members here, Andrew Reimer and Taylor Backrack, who materialized from Smithers in Ottawa. I'd like to turn it around a little bit, Minister Heyman. What can we do as local governments or as citizen activists to help you move climate action forward in BC and create the actions at a level of ambition that's relevant to the targets that we've set out there?
Thanks for the easy question. I'm tempted to just give the cheap answer, which is keep doing what you're doing, and I will give that, but you know, we established a Climate Solutions Council with some representation from a variety of sectors to help us identify opportunities, to give us feedback on Climate Action Secretariat plans, on potential threats to well-being of communities or individuals or industry and how to get around those. But there's so many more people who wanted to participate. So the model we're looking at is, as we start to deal with any issue, whether it's a particular industry, whether it's forestry, whether it's cement, whether it's transportation, whether it's northern communities or large urban centers, to bring groups of people in to work with the Climate Action Secretariat, lend your expertise. So that's one thing. The other thing is to work with us to raise awareness and enthusiasm among the populations who are generally more close to locally elected officials than they are to steps once removed, like the province, or twice removed, like the nation, and get people excited both about what we have to do to deal with the challenge, but what the tremendous opportunities of taking action now, both in terms of meeting the climate challenge that I think everybody in their gut wants to meet, without threatening their livelihoods, and in fact making their lives and communities, and more importantly, the future lives and communities of their kids better.
Here, fourth row from the back, yeah.
Thank you. My name is David Gregg. Thank you, Mr. Heyman. I have a question really about cross-pollination with the Ministry of Education. So as an elder, I have grandchildren, and I would like to know how they will be informed by the new regulations, if I may use that word. I really feel that there's hope through our children, more than perhaps the parents who are still driving the big SUVs. I think that we've seen how children hold parents to account over waste in the houses, and I'd like to see that there's some effort in cross-pollination from your department to the Ministry of Education. And is that going to happen? Thank you.
I think the easy answer is yes. I could point to some ways in which we do that, whether it's casual conversation or whether it's when we discuss in Cabinet a particular initiative, me introducing questions or ultimately recommendations for policy. But what I can say is I think a lot of that work is already happening in schools. A lot of it's driven by the ministry as well as teachers. I regularly receive letters from students, obviously encouraged by their teachers to do some research on climate or renewable energy or fossil fuels and write letters to me about what the heck are you doing about it.
So third row from the front. There.
Thank you. My name is David Hollingworth, and I'm a paramedic here in Vancouver. Our union last fall passed 5 resolutions that recognize the great risk of climate change, and we're also lobbying now our employer, BC Emergency Health Services, to adopt electric vehicle technology. I feel there's a tremendous opportunity with government fleets to lessen our carbon footprint through the adoption of electric vehicles, and it appears to be an initiative that is off the radar of many high-level managers at various levels of government organization. I'm wondering if you have a plan and what that plan would be to use the power of procurement using government fleets to increase the number of electric vehicles in British Columbia. I think it'd be a tremendously good thing.
Thank you. Well, we're building the plan overall, and it will include using government procurement and economies of scale in a number of areas, whether it's electric vehicles, transportation, retrofitting of public buildings. It will take some time to filter that down through. There's a lot of stuff going on, and while I'm ambitious and I want to get a lot done fast, we need a few more months, if not a couple of years, to get some very specific and concrete replacement plans that incorporate low-carbon alternatives.
We have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to really ask you to be concise with your questions, and I think everybody who I've nodded to will be able to get in.
So thank you, Minister. Thank you for me being here. My name is David Oliver. I'm with Cowlands Mobility Group, which is a transportation company here based in Vancouver. We focus on changing human behavior in transportation. And we know a lot of folks in different industries like transportation and other fields like building and so forth that focus on the same thing with great ideas. So the question is quite simple, is how do we engage with your minister?
How do you engage with my ministry?
How can we help you?
You can contact my ministry through the email addresses on the website or directly with my climate deputy, Bobby Plekas, or through the Climate Action Secretariat and say you have ideas, you'd like a chance to sit down and talk about them, and meetings will happen. Whether they include me will make them take a bit longer than otherwise. That's it.
Thank you.
And once again, don't forget to populate those forms, and you can either leave them on your table or pass them to one of the Renewable City staff on your way out. And we're going to go back here and then here. Right next to Taylor, back rock.
Hi, Minister Heyman. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us. My name is Corey Tull. I'm with the Canadian Freshwater Alliance. As we know, water is often one of the primary elements that is challenged when we see our climate changing, and urban watersheds are some of our most degraded watersheds across the province. And with this changes in our climate and the impacts that we're seeing, municipalities are often struggling with the responsibilities of maintaining the water systems in their communities. And from a climate perspective, I'm curious what the opportunities are that you see moving forward with really leveraging either BC's Water Sustainability Act or other opportunities to support municipalities in really building resilient urban watersheds in this time of a changing climate.
Thanks, Corey. We're not very far down that road. I've had a couple of meetings with representatives of the Polis Institute at UVic on water governance issues, specifically planning ahead on water sustainability issues. Part of this will be dealt with by, I think I'm cutting out a bit, part of this will be dealt with by land use planning review that's happening, being led by the Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resources, but in which we'll participate. But I haven't really begun much work on that because we've had a number of other initiatives in the last 6 months that I've been moving forward, although one of the first things we did was deal with a set of recommendations flowing from the central Okanagan pollution of the Halkar Aquifer that hopefully will guide management of agricultural waste and its pollution of water in all shallow aquifers around BC. So we're reviewing the agricultural waste regulation for that. That was notwithstanding the fact that we've moved on to environmental assessment and other things. Water is sitting here, and I continue to meet with water advocates and plan how we're going to move on that in the near future.
We'll go right here, and then one last question, back row.
Hi, Minister. My name is Byron Lee, and I'm a student from the University of Waterloo studying urban planning, and I'm here in Vancouver for co-op. And my question is just, I know that Vancouver or BC has a really big housing affordability issue similar to Toronto, and as we transition to the future, becoming more energy efficient, is the climate action plan that you were proposing, is it going to consider how city amenities are going to remain affordable for people in the city, millennials of all generations? Because I know that many municipalities this year are working on energy step codes and working on regulations to push buildings to reach step 3. And so I know that when we push buildings to reach step 3, it actually adds costs. And so I was wondering how we were going to, or how you're going to maintain buildings to become affordable.
So the Climate Action Plan or Secretariat won't address that directly, although I think broadly across government we're concerned about affordability. I think the truth is that ultimately the more builders adopt the technologies that get us to high energy efficiency or net zero, the cheaper the process becomes. That's been the experience in Europe, and certainly the energy savings of the people who live in the homes are realized. It takes longer in residential buildings, less time in multiple unit residential buildings, and can be done very quickly in commercial buildings. So, but it's not directly in my ministry.
You raised such a really important point, and I think we're not going to be able to advance the climate agenda without addressing the affordability agenda. And the City of Vancouver is starting to do it, City of North Van as well, in really meaningful ways, and that's the intensification of existing single family. There's never been a time in urban history in Canada where we've had so few people living in single family homes. There's more one-person occupied single-family homes than single-family homes occupied by 3, 4, 5 or more people. And many of those people want to downsize. They're dying to get out. And tragically, that's what happens. They die in their homes because there aren't opportunities for downsizing. And it's a huge opportunity. But we have to think about these issues in a very, very different way. We'll take one more question from the back, and then we really have to wrap up.
I thank you, Minister, for coming, and also for your stance in what's been dubbed the Battle of the Rosés. My topic is surrounding the LNG promotion by the Premier in his recent trip to China. He met with the people from LNG Canada, and that facility, if built, would kick out about 11 million tons of GHGs, which is 80% of our 2050 target. I have 3 children, each of whom has asked me, how does this square with our climate action plan? What answer do I give them?
What you can tell them is, first of all, the Premier's trip to Asia, that was one of many meetings he had with all sorts of people, despite the fact that the media chose to portray it as the purpose of the trip. The Premier and our government, as well as when we were in opposition, have always been clear that the development of LNG is predicated on 4 conditions, one of which is environmental and very specifically meeting our climate targets. So the Premier asked me to ask the Climate Action Secretariat to do an analysis of what the GHG impact of different sizes of LNG plants with different conditions placed on them might be. We're doing that work now, and we'll be discussing it. This needs to be a fact-based, science-based discussion. I understand fully that 11 megatons basically eats up most of the 2050 budget, but what we need is what do the numbers look like with different conditions, different sizes, and then that will lead our government to see where that fits in an overall industrial sectoral reduction plan. But our commitment to meet targets underlies all of it.
Targets, good way to wrap up our session, focusing on those targets. Lots of really thoughtful questions, thoughtful answers. What I hear is a really genuine interest to look at global best practices and practices across British Columbia, how they can be ramped up by local governments and the provincial government working together. We're going to continue these dialogues. We're pivoting carbon talks to focus very, very squarely on the urban agenda. That's 50% of our emissions. There's huge opportunities there. If you want to witness this again, this is on the YouTube, the Renewable Cities YouTube channel. And if you want to be back with us again and you aren't on our email list, make sure that you sign up on your way out the door. I really want to thank the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, and thank you all for your attendance, and our sponsors, PICS, North Growth Foundation, and the Sitka Foundation, and I hope we see you again. Thank you.